Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chel Gimel L'Mirz Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos, and we pick up today on the top line of Lamed Ches Amud Beis with a brand new Siman Reish Samech Dalid Dinei HaPesila V'HaShemen, the halachas pertaining to the wick and the oil, the fuel that will be used for the Neiros Shabbos Uba Yud Seifim, and here we have 10 Seifim. Our learning should be a schos for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasunim Batzara Ba'Shivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayam U'Bein Bayabasha, Hamalkeim Yirachem Aleihem V'Yitziem Yitzar L'Rvacha, Me'afela La'Eiro Mishibud L'Gula, Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv V'Naimar Amen. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, Ein Oisin Pesila L'Neiros Shabbos. You're not allowed to make a wick for Neiros Shabbos. Bein Ner She'al HaShulchan. This halacha pertains both to the Neiros of Shabbos that are located by the Suda, the Iker Neiros that we've learned. We've learned that the Iker Neiros are the ones that you're going to eat the Suda by. Those are the ones that the bracha should be made over. Bein Kol Ner Shemadlik Babayis. We also learned that back in the day when the homes were very dark, and you didn't have ambient light coming in from outside, from street lamps, etc., there was a need to light Neiros Shabbos in every room, mishum shalom bayis, shelo yikashel, so people shouldn't stumble around and be stubbing their toes. Those Neiros also should not be lit midavar shehaor einoi nechaz bay, using a kind of wick where the flame will not really take hold of the wick. Ela nisrach sevivav. If you have an inferior quality wick, then the nair, the flame, doesn't really take hold of the wick. Instead, the nair is just, the flame is just kind of on the surface of the wick, and it's kind of like jumping around. It doesn't take hold well. Ela nisrach svivav is just kind of hanging around. The word nisrach, the shirish of the word nisrach is srach, like we use it in halacha, mishum srach truma. It's something hanging on, so it's not really grabbing hold of the wick, and therefore v'ashal heves koifetzes, so that the flame is going to jump and to flicker. And the Mechaber gives some examples of inferior quality wicks. Kigoin semer, if you're using a wick made out of wool doesn't draw the oil well, and therefore it's not going to be a good flame. The flame is not really going to take hold of the wick. The seyar, or a wick that's made out of hair, the kiyotze behem, or other types of inferior quality wicks, or rather, the wick for the Neiros Shabbos should be made midavar shel or nisleboy, using a wick where the flame really takes hold of the wick and the flame really penetrates the wick, and it's going to be a nice stable flame. Kegoin, for example, pishta nefutza. An example of that would be combed flax, ubeget sheish, or something that was taken from a linen garment, so the fabric is linen, vitzemer gefen, or cotton, the canvas, or the Mechaber uses the word canvas, which I think we typically translate as hemp, the kiyotze behen, or other types of wicks that do draw the oil well, and therefore they make beautiful, stable flames. So just to sum up over here, the halacha that we've learned so far here in Sif Aleph, don't use for Neiros Shabbos inferior quality wicks that are not going to make a nice, stable flame. And that halacha applies not only to the Iker Neiros that you light by the Suda, but even to the secondary Neiros that you light in other rooms in the house for Shalom Bayis purposes. The Mechaber gave us examples. He says, what's an example of an inferior quality wick? A woolen wick, a wick made out of hair. What's an example of a good quality wick? That would be something like combed out flax, or linen, or cotton, or canvas. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Aleph, midavar, you should not use for Neiros Shabbos an inferior quality wick. Hatam bepsul psilois ushmanim. The underlying reason for all of the items that we're going to see are puzzle for use as wicks, or for types of fuel that are puzzle for use as fuel for Neiros Shabbos, is she'ein me'irin yafeh. They don't make nice light. they don't make a nice, clear, stable flame. And therefore, v'chayshinon, we must be concerned, shebeyate hakli. You might come to manipulate the lamp. You might come to move the either the keli that the shemen is in, or you might come even to manipulate the wick. Sheyavai hashemen shebesoichai el hapsila kedei sheyidlak yafeh. You might come to manipulate the nair. The nair is the lamp. That's the keli that's holding the fuel. So if you have a glass that has oil in it, and you have a burning wick inside it, but you're using an inferior quality wick or inferior quality oil so that the fuel, the oil, is not traveling well up the wick, you might be tempted to manipulate that glass, thereby bringing the oil closer to the flame, so then now suddenly it'll burn nicer. And if you do this, the chayiv mishum mavir, by doing that, by making the nair burn better, you are now going to be over the Issa Daraisa, the Meleches is the Malacha Asur of Mavir. You're creating a fire. You make a fire burn bigger, brighter. So that's the Isser of Havar. Ice cotton bays. One of the examples of a good quality wick that the Mechaber gave was canvas. The El Yerabba Kosav, the El Yerabba writes, did nochad lahachmir lechatchila becanvas, that lechatchila we should be machmir not to use canvas, im efsher ba'acher, if it's efsher to use a different type of high quality wick. The backstory of this is a machloikis rishonim when it comes to canvas. The question is canvas considered hayoytze min ha'etz? Is canvas considered something that comes from a tree? And the Mishnah says that you shouldn't use any material that comes from a tree. The question is, does that include canvas or not? The El Yerabba says that we should be machmir lechatchila and not use canvas, even though the Mechaber says that canvas is okay. All right, so that's the basic halacha over here. Now let's take a look 3 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch at the Ramah. Says the Ramah Hagah, v'im hidlik b'dvarim ha'asurim. Let's say you were over on this halacha, and somebody went ahead and did light hadlakas Neiros Shabbos using an inferior quality wick. Says the Ramah, if you do that, aser lihishtamesh la'oroi. You're not allowed to get any benefit. You're not allowed to use, not to get any benefit. Aser lihishtamesh. You're not allowed to use that light. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Gimel, ha'asurim. If you lit using something that is usr, something that you're not allowed to use to light. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that means bein pasul pasilois, whether you used a type of wick, that's pasul. So for example, you went ahead and you used something like wool, you used a woolen wick, which we said you're not allowed to use, or bein shmanim, or whether you used an inferior type of fuel, you used a type of oil that you're not supposed to use. Either way, said the Ramah, ois katan dalid, aser lihishtamesh. You're now not allowed to use the light that's coming from that nair. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this means afilu tashmish she'ein tzarich iyud. You're not allowed to use the light of that nair, even if you're using it for something that doesn't need intense concentration. For example, let's say you're being Mavris Sedra, all right? So all you're doing is reading psukim. This is not something that you need to ma'ayin. You're not learning a Shvera Tosfos. Let's say, you're not reading a Rabbeinu Chananel. You're not reading tiny, tiny letters that you need to concentrate. Over there, that is usher even by a regular nair. Even if you use good wicks, even if you use good oil, you're not allowed to use that light for a davar shetzarich iyun. You're not allowed to use the light of a nair on Shabbos for something that really you're going to have to look very closely at, because then that means you need a lot of light. Then we're always concerned, we're always chayshish, shemeyate, that you might come to manipulate the wick or manipulate the nair in order to increase the light. Over here, when the Ramah says that if you use psilois, you use wicks, or you use shemen, you use fuel that you're not supposed to use, and then the Ramah says if you do so, you're not allowed to use the light, you're not allowed to use the light even for something that does not require iyun, even for something that you could just, give a cursory glance. you're still not allowed to use the light, because with a puzzle, a wick, or puzzle shemen, we have to be afraid shemayata, even by something like that. So again, says the Mishnah Berurah cut and dalit. Over here, if you use puzzle or wicks or puzzle or oil, also lihishtamash afilu tashmish shein tzarich iyun, even something that you're looking at that doesn't really need iyun. Why? Shemayata, because we're afraid you might come to manipulate the nair of the wick. The ilu b'davar shetzarich iyun, because if we were talking about something shetzarich iyun, also lasis b'shabbos la'ar nair afilu b'nair yafeh, that you're not allowed to do even if you use a kosher wick, even if you use kosher shemen. You're not allowed to use the nair for something shetzarich iyun. Siman ayin reish hey, like we're going to see later on, but as Hashem Yisparach in Siman reish ayin hey, which the Mishnah Berurah writes as ayin reish hey, la'olam, a person should always use a lashon dekiya, and ra'ah reish ayin hey is not a lashon dekiya. Ra means bad, so we avoid it. We say ayin reish hey instead of reish ayin hey. V'ataz l'kamon b'sibit tov reish ayin gimel. The taz later on in sibit tov reish ayin gimel kosav, he writes, to be in yonenu, benegeya to the halacha that we're learning here, that if you use a puzzle a wick or you use puzzle a shemen, you're not allowed to use the nair. That halacha is true. Afilu b'yesh acher imay sheroya oisai. Even if you have somebody else sitting with you who's watching you. Normally we say that when you have somebody else that's together with you and he's watching what you do, we're not choishes shemayata. We're not worried that you might come to manipulate the nair of the wick. Why? Because there's somebody else there. If you stretch out your hand, he's going to hit your hand. He's going to say, no. Well, what are you doing? He's going to stop you. But over here, the Taz says that benegeya to this halacha, if you used puzzle of wicks or puzzle of shemen, then you're not allowed to use the nair. Afilu b'yesh acher imay sheroisai. Even if there's somebody else who's watching you, afilu hachi aser. Why? Because the efshali zar shalayata. When you use inferior quality wicks or inferior quality oil, we say that it's so probable that you're going to end up being mata the nair, that even having somebody else with you is not enough to guard against it, and therefore you're not allowed to use the nair. Okay, so we've seen the basic halacha, and we've seen the Ramah as to what happens if you do something in contravention of the halacha, if you do light inferior quality wicks or inferior quality oil. Now the Ramah is going to give us two kulas. And we're going to have to see, there's going to be a machlokes hapaiskim brought down in the Mishnah Berurah, exactly what these two kulos are. We're going to have to halt cup. We're going to have to follow through over here and understand exactly what's going on. So let's see the Ramah. Says the Ramah, V'yesh Omrim, 4 lines down near the end of the line. So this is going to be kula number 1. Says the Ramah, V'yesh Omrim, there are those that say, De'im yesh ner echad midvarim hamutarim. Let's say you lit one ner using kosher wicks. So one ner you lit with a cotton wick. You have a cotton wick, kosher wick. You have shemen zayis, so it's kosher oil. So you have one ner that's burning that's completely midvarim hamutarim. You have one good ner that's perfectly fine. In that case, says the Ramah, there's a yesharim that says muter lihishtamesh la'or ha'acherim. Now you could use the light of the other neiros, even if the other neiros are lit with inferior quality wicks. So you have a bunch of neiros that are lit with wool, but you have one there that's lit with cotton. Says the Ramah, you have a yesharim that says you have one ner that's okay. Now you could use the light even of the other neiros. Now we have to understand exactly what the case over here is. So let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Hay, Mutter Lihishtamesh. Explains the Mishnah Berurah that one shita, that this doesn't mean what you think it means. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Mutter Lihishtamesh, Afilu Hanerois Oimdois, Becheder Acher. This means, remember, we're going back in the day when they lit neiros in the dining room by the shulchan, by the suda, but they also lit neiros in the other rooms. So the bedrooms also had neiros lit in them for shalom bayis purposes. Says the Mishnah Berurah, when the Ramah says, if you have one ner that's good, you could use the light even of the other Neiros. You know what that means, says the Mishnah Berurah? Afilu ha-Neiros oimdos b'cheder acher. Even if the problematic Neiros are located in a different room, they're not in the same room as the good Neir. So let's say you lit good Neiros by the table. By the table, you used Shemen Zayis, you used cotton. So by the Suda, you have perfectly good Neiros. In the master bedroom, you have Neiros using wool. So those are bad Neiros. Says the Ramah, there's a Yesh Omrim, that if somewhere in the house you have good Neiros, now you're allowed to use the light of the bad Neiros, even if those are in different rooms in the house, nowhere near the good Neiros. Now what's the svara of that? So let's see the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah, Afilu ha-Neiros oimdos b'cheder acher. What's the logic? Dekev and sheyesh b'makam echad ner kosher. Since in one place in the house you lit a good Ner, in the mashal that I gave you by the dining room table, you lit good Neiros, Yizkar, you're going to remember, V'layata gam b'mekayim acherim. You're not going to come to be matan the Neiros in the bedroom. The logic of this, which the Mishnah Berurah doesn't clearly spell out, the logic is, when you went to light the Neiros, you made sure that by the dining room table, you used Shemen Zayis and you used cotton. Why? Because you know the halacha. You know that the halacha is that really you're supposed to use a good wick and you're supposed to use good oil. So when you lit downstairs by the dining room table, you used a good wick and you used good oil. Then maybe, you didn't have a lot of cotton. Or maybe cotton was very expensive. So upstairs in the master bedroom, you used wool, you used inferior quality. But the fact that you were nizhar, the fact that you understood the halacha, and you made sure that by the dining room table you used something that's kosher, that means you understand the inyan. You understand that it's a problem to light with inferior quality wicks. Why is it a problem to light with inferior quality wicks? Shemayate. You might come to manipulate the air. So once we know that you know the halacha, once we know that you remembered the halacha, and you were careful in one place in the house to use what you're supposed to use, now we're no longer chayshish that you might come to be mata. Kain pirish b'Magen Avram. That's how the Magen Avram explains this Ramah. Now it's critical that we lock this down in our minds. So according to the Magen Avram, the first kula given to us by the Ramah is that if you light a good Ner anywhere in the house, then you could use the light of bad Neiros anywhere else in the house, even if they're far away from the good Neiros. That's kula number one, according to the Magen Avram. Now, a simple reading of the Ramah, you would not have learned Pshat in the Ramah like the Magen Avram, just from reading the words of the Magen Avram. And indeed, the Eliyah Rabbah disagrees with the Magen Avram. Says the Mishnah Berurah weiter, Ube Eliyah Rabbah Kosav, the Eliyah Rabbah disagrees with this. And the Eliyah Rabbah writes, Ube Eliyah Rabbah Kosav, the Eliyah Rabbah writes, Shekavonas HaRamah, the intent of the Ramah with this kula is, Hainu Dafka Ba'oiseh Cheder Atzmai. The Ramah says, no. The Ramah is not giving you a kula that if you have a kosher in there in the dining room, you could use the light of a puzzle in there upstairs in the master bedroom. What the Ramah is telling you is, if you have a kosher in there in the dining room, and you also have a puzzle in there in the dining room, you could use the light of the puzzle in there in the dining room. Since there's also a kosher in there in the dining room, you could use the light of the puzzle in there also. That's how the Eliyah Rabbah learns. Very different kula. According to the Eliyah Rabbah, this kula is a much smaller kula. When the Ramah says that if there's a kosher in there, you could use the puzzle in there, that means that they're together in the same room. According to the Magen Avram, it means even if it's somewhere else in the house. Okay, we have to lock that in our mind because it's going to become negay again weiter. Vayin b'Bir Agra, going further in the Mishnah Berurah is Katnei. Vayin b'Bir Agra. He says, take a look at the Bir Agra b'Dibur HaMaschil v'Yesh Omrim De'im, where he says, Medama in Yonenu l'ner Chanukah l'hayesh Omrim Hazeh. In the context of this kula, the Bir Agra compares this halacha to another halacha by Neiros Chanukah. What's going on here? Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'sham, by Neiros of Chanukah, haloi eina muter lehistamish l'ner Chanukah, ki im kisha kosher oimen etzlam. What's the halacha by Neiros Chanukah? Right? We know, Haneris halalu kodesh ve'in lo rishus lishtamish bohem. You're not allowed to use the light of the Neiros Chanukah. That's why on all of our menorahs, we have a shamish. Why do we have a shamish? Because the shamish is not kodesh. The shamish is not one of the Neiros Shal Mitzvah. It's not a Neiros Shal Chanukah. It's just a shamish. So now you could use the light of the menorah. Why? Because you're really using the nair of the shamish. Since the shamish is there, you could use the other nairs also. Now, what would happen if you had a menorah by the window in the dining room and you had a shamish in the kitchen? Would we say that because you have a shamish in the kitchen, now you could use the light of the menorah that's in the dining room? No. So the Berurah Gra says the halacha over here, where the Ramah says that if you have a kosher in there, you could use the light of the puzzle in there. That's like the halacha by Neiros Shal Chanukah. Just like by Neiros Shal Chanukah. If you have the Neiros Shal Chanukah and next to it you have a shamish, you could use the light of the menorah because the shamish is next to it. So too over here, when the Ramah says that if you have a ner kosher, you could use the light of the ner puzzle, that's only if they're next to each other, not if it's in the other room. So we have a Berurah Gra that seems to say very clearly like the El Yerabah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hare de Mefarish Kel Yerabah. So the Berurah grows clearly learning like the El Yerabah. The Chen B'Sefer Carbon Nesanel Machmer Kishoimid B'Cheder Acher. So too the Carbon Nesanel says if the ner kosher is in a different room, you can't use the ner puzzle in the other room. Okay. So let's just tie up over here what the first kula of the Ramah was. The halacha is that if you light a ner puzzle, if you light a ner using an inferior wick or inferior fuel, the Ramah said you're not allowed to be mishtamish la'orei. You're not allowed to use that light. Why? Shemayata. We're afraid you might manipulate the wick or manipulate the ner and be over on the isser of havara. Says the Ramah kula. But if you have a ner kosher, so you have a ner kosher and a ner puzzle, then you could use the light. Comes along the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram says a very big chiddush. The Magen Avram says, you want to know how big a kula this is? I'll tell you how big a kula this is. The Ramah is saying, if you have a ner kosher in the dining room, you could use the light of the ner puzzle in the master bedroom. Epis a logic that since you lit a ner kosher in the dining room, you understand the halacha. We're not afraid. We're not choishes shemayate. El Yerabah says, what are you talking about? The kula is not that big a kula. The kula is if you have a ner kosher and a ner puzzle together in the same room, then you could use the light of the ner puzzle. Why? Because there's a ner kosher there. So we'll say that you're using the light of the ner kosher. That's how the El Yerabah learns. And the Berurah Gra backs it up and the Carbon Nesanel backs it up. That's kula number one. Now let's see kula number two. Kula number two is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch, middle of the line. Kula number two, v'chein, similarly. Davar she'efsher b'loy ner, something that you could do without a light. Mutar l'asos afilu eitzel neres ha'acherim. If you want to do something that doesn't require light, and there's a ner in the room that is a ner puzzle, it's using inferior wick, inferior oil, we're not going to tell you that you can't do something that doesn't require light. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Vav. What's the example of something that you could do without an air? Says the Mishnah Berurah, lishka b'cheder. You go into a room and you want to lay down. You want to take a nap. And in that room, there's an air puzzle. Are we going to say, oh, there's an air puzzle in that room? You're not even allowed to walk into the room. You want to go take a nap? You can't take a nap in that room. There's an air puzzle. No, I'm not being mishtamish lo'iroi. I don't need light to take a nap. Adarabba, I don't want light to take a nap. So says the Mishnah Berurah, lishka b'cheder. Or another case, more interesting case. Limshaych yayin min hamartef. You want to go downstairs to the wine cellar. Now, you lit Neiros Shabbos in the wine cellar because you're going to use the wine cellar on Shabbos. So it needs an air. It needs an air. Shalom bayis, shelo yikashel. You shouldn't trip. You shouldn't stumble. So you did the right thing. You lit an air in the martef, but you used an inferior wick or inferior oil. Now you want to go down to the wine cellar and you want to take wine out of a barrel. You want to fill up a flask. You want to fill up a pitcher, a decanter of wine for the Suda. So you want to go downstairs and you want to go to the barrel and fill up a decanter of wine. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's something that doesn't need light. But he qualifies this. V'hainu derech kli shekarin hun oy liber b'lashon Ashkenaz. What this means is you want to fill up a decanter, but you're going to fill up the decanter using some kind of a spigot or some kind of a faucet. So there's some kind of attached to the barrel of wine, there's some kind of a spigot where you take the decanter, you put it under the faucet, you turn the valve, and the decanter fills up. Says the Mishnah Berurah, for that you don't really need light. All you need to do is, you need to feel the faucet, you put the decanter under the spigot, you turn the valve, it fills up, you close the valve, and now you walk out of the room. You don't really need light for that. So you have a nair in that room that's inferior quality wick, inferior quality oil, you're allowed to do that because you don't need the nair. That's not called being mishtamish with the aura, with the light of the nair puzzle. That's not called using the nair puzzle. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, avaloi derech barza, but you can't fill up your decanter of wine through the barza. What's a barza? A barza is where the barrel does not have a spigot. All the barrel has is a hole, and the hole has a stopper in it. And what you do is you pull out the stopper and you fill up the decanter. Then you need light. You know why you need light? Because in that case, there's no spigot that's directing the flow of the wine. When you have a spigot that's directing the flow of the wine, so you feel where the spigot is, you take the decanter, you put it under the spigot, you turn the valve, it fills up. But when there's just a hole with a stopper, when you pull the stopper out, the wine is going to gush out. If you can't see where the wine is going, you're not going to know where to put the decanter. You can end up with wine all over your suit, your shoes, on the floor. So over there, you need light. So to do that by the ur of an air puzzle, that you're not allowed to do. Okay. Now, here's where we get a little complicated. So far what we see is like this. The second kula of the Ramah seems to be that anything that doesn't require light, you could do by the light of a nair puzzle, because you don't really need light at all. Now, a simple reading of the Ramah would seem to be that this is true anywhere in the house. And it's true whether or not there's a nair kosher in the house or not. Even if the only neiros in your house are nair puzzle, they're all neiros that use inferior quality wicks or inferior quality oil. If the thing that you're doing doesn't require light, you're allowed to do it. That would be a simple reading of the Ramah. Let's take a look here at Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Zayin. Mutter lasois. The Ramah said something that doesn't need light. Mutter lasois. El Yerabba pirish. The El Yerabba explains this. Now, in order to understand the El Yerabba, we have to go back to the El Yerabba's pshat in the first kula. The El Yerabba's pshat in the first kula of the Ramah was that the first kula of the Ramah is not such a huge kula. The El Yerabba learned that the first kula of the Ramah is you have a nair kosher and a nair puzzle in the same room. So let's say by the Suda, you have one nair kosher and one nair puzzle. Okay, says the Ramah, since you have a nair kosher and a nair puzzle, you could use the light because there's a nair kosher right there. You have a nair puzzle upstairs in the master bedroom? No, you can't use the light of that nair puzzle upstairs in the master bedroom. You can't do that. There's no nair kosher there. The nair kosher is downstairs in the dining room. That's the way the El Yerabba understood the first kula. Now let's see how the El Yerabba understands the second kula. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Zayin. El Yerabba pirish. The El Yerabba explains the second kula. Dafka kishiyesh al kol panim ner echad kosher babayis. Shal yedei zeh muter afilu b'cheder acher. The way the El Yerabba understands the second kula, he makes the second kula also a little bit smaller. The first kula is if you have a ner echad that's kosher and a ner echad that's puzzle in the same room, you could use the light of the ner puzzle in that room. Could you use the light of the ner puzzle in a different room? No, you can't. But if what you want to do upstairs in the master bedroom is something that doesn't require light, if you want to go upstairs to the master bedroom and you want to take a nap, you want to go downstairs to the wine cellar and you want to fill up a decanter of wine and you have a spigot, so now you're doing something that doesn't need light, then as long as you have a ner kosher somewhere in the house, you're allowed to do that. But what if you don't have a ner kosher in the house? If you don't have a ner kosher anywhere in the house, then even a tashmish that doesn't need a ner is aser. So the El Yerabba is cutting down both kulas. Again, according to the El Yerabba, the first kula that the Ramah said that if you have a ner kosher, you could use the light of the ner puzzle. That's only true if they're both together in the same room. If they're not together in the same room, you can't. The second kula of the Ramah is If you have a ner kosher somewhere in the house, then if you want to do a tashmish that doesn't need a ner, you could do it anywhere in the house, even in a different room than the ner kosher. Then, since you have a ner kosher somewhere in the house, you could do a tashmish that doesn't require a ner anywhere in the house. But if you don't have a ner kosher in the house, if you don't have even one ner kosher in the house, then you can't even take a nap in a room that has a ner puzzle. Why? I'm not using the ner. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. If you lit a ner that you weren't allowed to light, you lit a ner puzzle, inferior quality wick, inferior quality oil, you're not allowed to do anything in that room, even if it's something that doesn't need an ner. Only if there's a ner kosher somewhere in the house, then you could. So that's the way the Elyer Rabbah understands it. Aval sha'arei achroinim pirshu, but the other achroinim, they disagree with the Elyer Rabbah, and they inflate this kula as well. They explain tafilu ein ner kosher klal, even if you don't have a ner kosher anywhere in the house, mutar lahayesh omer mazeh. They learn that this kula is a much bigger kula. So they seem to learn like the Magen Avram. They learn that the first kula is you have one ner kosher in the house, you're allowed to use the light of the ner puzzle anywhere else in the house. I don't care where. There's a ner kosher in the dining room, and upstairs in the master bedroom you only have a ner puzzle. You could use the light of the ner puzzle upstairs in the master bedroom since you have a ner kosher downstairs in the dining room. That's kula number one. Kula number two is, if you don't have a single ner kosher anywhere in the house only has Neiros psulim, they only have inferior neros, but you're doing something that doesn't need light. If you're doing something that doesn't need light, you could do it, because that's not called being mishtamish la'oray. That's this machlokes over here. Okay, how do we rule? Well, let's go weiter in the Ramah. Says the Ramah, u'litzorich Shabbos yesh lahakol b'diavad. So the Ramah gave us two kulas, and now the Ramah says that b'diavad litzorich Shabbos, if you lit inferior quality neros, and now you have a tzorich Shabbos, you could be makel like these two kulas. Says the Mishnah Berurah ches b'diavad. V'em yesh ner echad kosher v'oimed etzloi ner puzzle. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, okay, the Ramah said that b'diavad l'tzorich Shabbos, you could be makel like these two kulas that he gave us. Says, so he only wants to be makel l'tzorich Shabbos. So however you learn these two kulas, whether you learn these two kulas like the Magen Avram and the Shari Achronim, or you learn these two kulas like the Elyer Rabbah, the Ramah says that you should only use these two kulas if it's l'tzorich Shabbos b'diavad. You did this b'diavad, now you have a tzorich Shabbos, you could be makel like these two kulas. Says the Mishnah Berurah. But I'll give you another case where you could be makel even not l'tzorich Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'em yesh ner echad kosher v'oimed etzloi ner puzzle. In the case where you have a ner kosher and a ner puzzle together in one room, in that case, kasav Magen Avram, the Magen Avram says, the mutar lehishtamesh afilu l'shaloi l'tzorich Shabbos. Over there, you mamish don't even need a tzorich Shabbos. Now remember, the Magen Avram is the one who said that the first kula of the Ramah is a very big kula. The Magen Avram said that if you have one ner kosher in the dining room, and upstairs in the master bedroom you only have a ner puzzle, the kula of the Ramah is that you could use that ner puzzle upstairs in the dining room, in the master bedroom. But the Ramah says that's only true l'tzorich Shabbos. Says the Magen Avram, but in the simpler case, in the Elyer Rabbah's case, where downstairs in the dining room you have one ner kosher and one ner puzzle, that is mutar even shaloi l'tzorich Shabbos. You don't need such a big shasat chak in order to be soimich on that kula. So says the Magen Avram. Because let's say the ner puzzle wouldn't even be there. Let's say only the ner kosher would be there. You would have enough light. So you don't have to worry about the fact that there's also a ner puzzle. And this is, says the Mishnah Berurah, but any heter that we have to use the light of a ner puzzle is only b'diavad when you already did this. When we time the came in the yesh ner kosher, because once you have a ner kosher, shamad l'kiyafeh, su lo yasi lahatos. We could say a svara that you're not going to come to be mateh, but it's only b'diavad. Avalein lahakal mitam zeh lahadlik lechatchila ner kosher and puzzle. But the Pri Megadim points out, don't think that this is a heter lechatchila. Don't think you could say, oh, the Ramah, Rei Samach Daled Sif Aleph. I could light an air kosher and an air puzzle, and then I could use the yor. No, it's only b'di'evet. It's not lechatchila. You can't use this heter lechatchila. Okay, now we move along to Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber. Karach davar shemadlikin boy al davar she'ein madlikin boy. You took, let's say, cotton. Cotton, we said, semer gefen, is something that you're allowed to use for a wick. So you took cotton, but instead of making a wick just out of cotton, first you took some wool. So you took a woolen wick. A woolen wick is something that's not good. That's a davar ha'aser. You took a woolen wick, you wrapped it in cotton. So now you have a combination of a davar ha'muter and a davar ha'apostle. Says the Mechaber, Karak davar shamadlikin boy. You wrapped a wick that you are allowed to use, al davar she'ein madlikin boy, over a material that you're not allowed to use. So it depends, says the Mechaber. What was your kavana? Im niskaven laha'avois. If your kavana was that you wanted to create a bigger wick, you didn't have enough cotton. So you said, okay, I have some wool. I'll wrap the cotton around the wool, and now I'll have a good, nice-sized wick. Im niskaven laha'avois pirish. What does the word laha'avois mean? La'asoisa ava, to make the wick thicker. Hapsila, you want to make the wick thicker. Why? Kidei lahoisif oira. A bigger wick makes a bigger flame. So if your kavana was to use the material that you're not allowed to use in order to make a bigger wick so as to have a bigger flame, aser. Then this is aser. Says the Mishnah Berurah's cotton test, aser. Why is it aser? After ata yideh kricha or nechaz umeir yafeh v'loy asi lahatois. Even though the fact is, once you have the cotton wrapped around the wool, now the flame is going to take very good hold of the cotton and it won't flicker. So l'chayri, you don't have the problem, the chash, that you're going to come to be mata the nair because the nair is flickering. So there doesn't seem to be a reason for the gzeira over here. There doesn't seem to be a reason to aser you from using the light. Says the Mechaber, it's still aser, you're not allowed to use the light. Why? Since your kavana in this case was to really make the wool part of the wick, you wanted to have a nice big wick. You didn't have enough cotton. So you mixed the cotton together with the wool. But you want the wool to be part of the wick. You want it to be a nice big thick wick, to have a nice big fire. So now we're going to aser it because we're afraid if we tell you that this is mutter, you're going to end up coming to use wool alone. Because you're going to say, what do you mean? I always use wool inside my wicks. So now one Shabbos, you won't have any cotton. You're going to use wool alone. So that was the first halacha here in Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber weiter, 4 lines off the bottom, middle of the line, but ve'im niskaven lahakshois hapsila. But if the only reason you're using the wool is because maybe the cotton itself is not firm enough. The cotton is too weak. It's too flimsy. Kedei shetei medes. You want to add the wool so that the wick should stand nice and straight. V'loi tishal shalamata. It shouldn't fall down. So then mutter. Then it's mutter to do this. Because it's going to burn nicely since you have the cotton. And you're not looking to make the wool part of the wick. You're not looking to have the wool as a wick to make the flame. No, you want the cotton to make the flame. You're using the wool as a stiffener. You're not using it as a wick. And for this reason, says the Mechaber, mutter likrach davar shemadlikin boy. You could take a material that you're allowed to use for a wick, and you're allowed to wrap it al gabe gemi, around a piece of a reed, a kash, or around a piece of a straw. These are things that you don't use for wicks. So that you should be able to have a firm wick and put it into a lantern. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cotton yud mutter. I feel a madlik shneim yakad. Even though you're lighting the cotton and the wool, or the cotton and the gemi, you're lighting them together. Because again, in this case, you're using the inferior quality material not as a wick. You're using it as a stiffener. And therefore this is mutter like gazrubai. Finally, says the Ramah, an interesting case that I don't truly understand the Metzias over here, but says the Ramah Hagot, Noistin garger shel melach. You could take a grain of salt, or gris shel pul, or a split bean, al pi haner, at the opening of an oil lamp, be'erev Shabbos. You could put it there on erev Shabbos, kedei sheyehi doilik yafeh b'Shabbos. Somehow, by putting a grain of salt at the opening of the nair, at the opening of the lamp, or putting a split bean at the opening of the lamp, it makes the nair burn nicer. You're allowed to do this on erev Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, shal melach is cut yud aleph, a grain of salt. Levisha melach tzoylel hashemen. It sounds like somehow the salt clarifies the oil. Shetimashech achar apsila. It makes it go up the wick better. Ice cut yud beis shall pull a split bean kedei lahaniach apsila olav. Somehow it supports the wick. Ubetoisef the parak beis isa tama oisakain kedei sheyeh shoya v'doilik. Somehow it makes it burn longer. You're allowed to do this on erev Shabbos. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be Megan. Algan's Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should send Yeshua's for us. Parnasset Shaduchim to all those in need. We should be zoichet to see the Bias Kal Tzedek. B'meherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.